Hey, political science 145 students, world politics students. We're going to continue our discussion of multinational corporations. And as we mentioned last time, the tide turned in terms of attitudes and welcoming corporations into developing or developed countries. So this cycle of support and opposition continued. With the end of the Cold War, multinationals were welcome. The welcome mat was rolled out. And now they were, if you remember, they were considered monsters in the past. Now they were everybody's favorite monster. And there was competition to bring them into your country. And this competition highlights the positive aspects of multinational corporations that were always there, but weren't emphasized during earlier periods when their negative aspects, their negative contributions were highlighted. So multinationals have a number of positive impacts on developing countries. Developing countries wooed multinationals after the end of the Cold War until about 2010 because multinationals create jobs. I mean, we do this in the United States. We seek, it's an American multinational, but there's a competition over where Amazon will place its second headquarters. There's a competition when foreign auto manufacturers hope to open up plants within different states. States offer incentives, lower their taxes in order to entice these firms to come because it creates jobs, good paying jobs in those communities. And think about developing countries. These are much better paying jobs than what local companies offer. Local conditions allow typically. They introduce modern technology. So they introduce manufacturing techniques and technology that would not otherwise be introduced locally. They inject capital into countries. Think about, again, this is from the 1990s on till fairly recently, many developing countries face tremendous debt burdens. They had to take out loans from international institutions, and they needed debt restructuring to try to maintain their debt payments to Western or first tier financial institutions. So loans weren't on the offer. But foreign direct investment, because foreign companies saw potential for lower labor costs or skilled labor or some of the highly educated labor force, say India with call centers and things like that. Foreign direct investment just pumped capital into these economies. And we saw from the chart last time that if you look at the total value, the stock of foreign direct investment, it just took off in the 1990s. Another reason foreign direct investment took off in the 1990s is democratization. This was a wave of democratization with the end of the Cold War that lasted until about 5, or some would argue 10 years ago. So as more countries started to democratize, this led populations to have greater influence over policymakers, and also because societies were more open, they saw Western products more frequently. They saw Western, say, media programming, television shows, etc., magazines, and they wanted those higher living standards themselves. And they pressed governments to allow in Western multinationals with the hope that that would be an engine for growth for their countries. Envy is a very powerful force. So even if it meant inviting in these monsters as they were viewed in the past, the hope was that it would generate higher living standards. A funny story, a funny example of that is that in these early stages of the boom of multinational investment, China opened up, and China opened up to Western firms like Western fast food firms or multinationals serving various agricultural products. And the largest McDonald's was built in Beijing. It's now been closed. It was bulldozed to make way for a shopping mall. Property in Beijing is very, very sought after. But this was a 700-seat McDonald's that was opened in Beijing. When it opened, it was perhaps the only McDonald's in the world that had a Communist Party official sitting there watching every transaction, watching the registers to make sure there wasn't capitalist exploitation of the people from this Western firm. But I enjoyed the stories of the opening of this McDonald's, because when this opened, McDonald's was incredibly expensive within China. People would pay about 6% of their monthly salary for a regular hamburger, not a cheeseburger, small fry, and a small drink. They'd pay the equivalent of about $1.81 when their monthly salary was $31 a month on average. And so they'd pay 6% of their salary for a small fry, small burger, regular burger, and a small drink. And they interviewed, Western reporters interviewed some of the people at the restaurant at the time. And I enjoyed an interview from a student who said, it's a bit expensive, I guess, but it's okay for a high fashion restaurant. So this was a totally new experience at the time. Peoples around the world hadn't been exposed to McDonald's, including in China. There are other reasons why multinationals were welcomed in during this period. And again, they were no knights in shining armor. A lot of their disadvantages, all the things we listed previously, still existed. But some of the negative effects that were trumpeted during the era of skepticism of multinationals were really overstated. So some critics argued that when multinationals move into a firm, it creates great wealth inequality, great wealth disparity amongst the population. But economic growth, rapid economic growth, inevitably creates wealth disparities. So growth itself does this. And multinational corporations tend to invest in countries that are growing, because that's where profits can be made, and that's where infrastructure is being built, et cetera. And so how do you know whether it's the growth or the foreign investment or the pre-existing growth that's creating these disparities? And if you want growth, there will be some disparity. Another argument is that multinationals eroded traditional values. So the example of the Beijing McDonald's, or the example of Coca-Colaization that we gave before, seeking after Western products that really are inappropriate for development, and the example of Coca-Cola for the health of many people in developing countries. But again, this criticism, economic growth itself erodes traditional values. Economic openness itself allows foreign influence, other influences in. So do you want this growth, or do you want to cling to traditional values? As we're going to talk about in just a moment, the pendulum swung back again, and it favors traditional values more over the past 5 years, at least 10 years, many would argue. Some argued that, so looking at the example of Allende in Chile, looking at Mossadegh in Iran and other examples where Western governments helped to install authoritarian governments to the benefit of the Western multinationals, some argued that multinational investment tended to lead to pressures that promoted authoritarian government as opposed to democratic government, because authoritarian government was assumed to be more stable and less volatile for multinational investment. But that doesn't ring true because multinational investment surged during the same period. There was a wave of democratization across the globe. So that really doesn't ring true. Another criticism goes back to those covert subversive activities of Western governments. Um, there was this fear that if multinationals were let into your country, Western governments would always be insidiously working to promote their cause and potentially undermine your national interests, as occurred with these coups that were instigated by the CIA. But really, home state multinational relations are much, much more complicated, much more complex than this. Um, Home states and multinationals can have very fraught relationships. Great example, really fascinating example, is Angola and the US oil company Gulf Oil. Angola has rich oil fields, especially off the coast, um, on the Atlantic coast. They have rich oil holdings in their country, and they're a major oil exporter. Angola fell in the Civil War. During the Cold War, the socialist government essentially won the Civil War, the MPLA, and defeated the Western-backed UNITA forces that were trying to take over the capital, Luanda. And eventually, a massive Soviet and especially Cuban military intervention helped to shore up that socialist government within Angola because of pressures from the West and money flowing into these rebel forces. So, who was the multinational exporting oil from Angola, socialist Angola? It was the American multinational Gulf Oil. So, you get by the 1980s, when Reagan really pushed to roll back communism around the world, and the Reagan administration funneled money into revolution, freedom fighters, Western-backed revolutionaries around the world, you had just bizarre episodes like this one, where you had Cuban troops for years stationed on oil platforms and in oil refineries in Angola, guarding them. Who are they guarding them against? They're guarding them against, so Cuban, communist soldiers guarding them against Western-backed, Western-armed, Western-funded rebels. And you had American personnel working there, an American multinational being protected, with American personnel being protected from US-backed rebels by Cuban troops. So this notion that home states always work to undermine local governments and always work on behalf of their multinationals, it's a lot more complex than that. And actually, recent history has shown that as well, in terms of American governments and other governments and their approaches towards their multinationals. So the pendulum has swung again, as I mentioned, especially with the housing crisis and that economic catastrophe, which is only a little over a decade behind us, but also with the rise of populism in many democratic countries like the Trump administration, putting America first. Multinational investment has stagnated and really declined over the past handful of years. So the previous graph we showed was the total value, the total stock in terms of multinational investment. These are the flows, the annual flows in terms of increasing flows or decreasing flows. And you see that they've stagnated since the past 2 decades, really, but especially since 2000, the financial crisis, after some disruption following 9/11. the financial crisis, they've declined and remain fairly stagnant. And why is this the case? So these ruthless, stateless monsters, in a sense, ran their course in terms of efficiency. Multinational investment is really being rolled back now. And at best, it's a steady state in many countries. One reason is the benefits of scale. They've just been maxed out. Um, the benefits of what you would call arbitrage, going to places where the currency is higher or lower to take advantage, or going to places for tax benefits or lower wage costs. A lot of these benefits have really been maxed out around the world by global corporations. And companies get stuck in, they've learned, as they learned in China, they get enmeshed and stuck in these supply chains, and then they can't really move to a place with lower wages. And so Chinese wages are going up, but there are these complex supply chains that have been built around Chinese manufacture by foreign multinationals, and foreign multinationals can't just easily extract themselves. So a lot of the benefits that were said to be gained by multinationals and their flexibility just to freely move across border wherever profits are highest and costs are lowest, they've been played out across much of the globe in terms of what can be gained. And because of that, the Forbes 500 we talked about, their profits dropped on average almost 25% from 2013 to 2018 as multinational investment kind of retrenched. And local firms' profits increased by 2% over that same time period. So the multinational era seems to be waning. Home country support has eroded. The mood in terms of supporting multinationals has changed in many Western and also other industrialized countries. The rise of populism is part of this. So the Trump administration in the United States, the populist administrations in other Western countries like Britain with Boris Johnson, Hungary, Poland, there are other examples. These populist movements emphasized economic autarky or more self-sufficiency, or really keeping economic gains at home as opposed to exporting them abroad via multinationals. So multinationals weren't always viewed positively anymore at home by home countries, especially when they build plants across the globe. They're seen as taking jobs away, creating jobs across the rest of the world, but not supporting jobs at home. And we saw this with the Trump administration beating that drum consistently for American manufacturing companies to bring their factories back home, to give jobs, to create jobs for American workers, because it was America first. Another issue is trade wars. So with the economic nationalism that underpins trade wars disrupt supply chains. Trade wars have led countries to force low multinationals to create ever higher percentages of local content within their products. Trade wars create friction in terms of investment and with these supply chains, which fears of the future, and that limits the prospects for investment. Labor, so tighter immigration controls. Think about immigration in Europe after the influx of refugees from Syria, immigration in the United States. We all know about the southern border and all the political controversy there. But the free movement of labor reduces labor costs, and that's beneficial to multinational corporations. As labor is less able to move freely, that increases labor costs. And that, again, erodes the disadvantage of moving across borders because you don't know when New barriers to immigration are going to be raised, and labor costs will rise as soon as you invest in sunk costs and have physical plant within a country. So things are just much more fraught in terms of multinational investment. Another example is COVID. Of course, we don't know fully what the ramifications of COVID will be. I probably won't know for multiple years, but foreign direct investment decline, it's estimated as much as 40% um, during 2020 because of the COVID outbreak, for reasons that should be obvious to all of you. Globalization through multinational corporations is just much less um, viable when countries are locking down their borders and people are quarantined and on lockdown and not able to go out to their workplaces, etc. Investment abroad is much in physical plan is much more difficult in this context. So the future of multinational corporations will most likely be regional rather than global because of this. And in a sense, multinational corporations have always been more regional than global, with exceptions like Samsung or Apple or Google or auto firms like Mercedes-Benz or Ford, for example. And there are good reasons why most multinational investment has been more regional than global. Um, One is that cultural similarities and language similarities just make marketing your products and creating products that are beneficial or sought after in those local markets, much easier, much easier. Makes staffing easier, makes you more aware of local consumer tastes. It's just harder to move across these large cultural gaps and market your products and understand cultural tastes very effectively. More than that is that because of geographic proximity, multinational corporation historically has been more regional, and companies tend to build on past success. Their trajectories tend to be path dependent, and so they continue to invest in more local proximities. And we can see why this is important with something called the Chevy Nova Awards, which people have tongue in cheek made these awards about the failures of marketing attempts of global multinationals when they tried to create markets for their wares, create demand for their wares across vast cultural divides. And there's just a whole bunch of these that there's a long story of such blunders by multinational corporations. And the Chevy Nova is the classic example because translated into Spanish, I mean, we tried to sell these Novas, but Nova means no go. Nova means it doesn't go. So it's a classic example of a failure. And that's a regional failure. That's within the region and not understanding local tastes or marketing appropriately to local tastes. And there are a number of just really hilarious examples of this. Coca-Cola, when it was first translated into Chinese, depending on the dialect, but especially in the Taiwanese dialect, it was translated into bite the wax tadpole, or another one, depending on the dialect, was female horse stuffed with wax. That just doesn't, not very appetizing to me, not very thirst quenching. Bite the wax tadpole. Eventually, it was retranslated into something called using the characters into happiness for your mouth. Another example is Pepsi. It's been a while, but they had an ad campaign called Come Alive with the Pepsi Generation, and translated into Chinese, it was basically Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave. Here's the Walking Dead enjoying some Pepsi. There are just countless of these where multinationals fail because they didn't understand the local market. Um, Really funny one. Clairol had this curling iron called the Mist Stick. Mist in German is slang for manure. So it's called the manure stick in German. It didn't lead to huge sales increases or a high volume of sales in Germany. American Airlines fly with leather, translated into Spanish was fly naked. I don't, maybe that helped their marketing campaign. I'm not sure. I don't think it was intentional. One I think is cute, is kind of funny. It's a very recent one. Uzbekistan Airlines with their English language slogan and advertising, "Good luck." Doesn't lead to a lot of confidence. Good luck. Hope you make it. Hope you land. Doesn't lead to a lot of confidence for the airline. And there are just a whole bunch of these. Coors' initial translation of their slogan, "Turn it loose," into Spanish was "Suffer from diarrhea." Um, Frank Perdue, you may have remembered his slogan, "Takes a strong man to make a tender chicken." Um, well translated into Spanish, it was translated into "It takes an aroused man to make a chicken affectionate." Yeah, didn't go over well. Parker Penn, they they uh, they had an ad campaign claiming it won't leak in your pocket and embarrass you. Pretty straightforward, pretty bland, but they used the Spanish word, and I don't speak Spanish, embarazar, which they thought meant embarrass, but it really means impregnate. So it won't leak it in your, their advertisement in Spanish read, "It won't leak in your pocket and make you pregnant." Mm, uh, that's a good thing from a pen. I don't think it went over well. There are just many examples. And if you look at companies that aren't multinationals, if they did try to sell their products, there are funny examples here as well. A The most prominent Iranian dishwashing detergent is something called Barf, which has a very different meaning in Farsi than BARF than it does in English. And here's this cola from Ghana. In the local language, and this is the most prevalent cola in Ghana, in the local language, P means very good. It's very good cola. But probably if you landed in Ghana and you went to buy a cola, may not be super appetizing to you or enticing to you to get a P cola. So again, there's a retreat from multinational corporations in terms of their reach and their influence. Most likely with the rise of nationalism, with increasing trade competition between the United States and China and other countries around the world, we're going to see a period of retrenchment by multinational corporations. And investment's going to be much more regional. But even regionally, multinational corporations, like with these examples we've given, can stumble when they move into new markets or different markets. So that's it for multinational corporations. Um, keep up on your quizzes. Talk to you soon.